Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set live is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
I remain simple, easy, and awesome.
And awesome like your beautiful shirt.
Thank you so much for your appreciation. But what about your incredibly beautiful looking jacket?
Thank you, Shaka. A warm welcome to you. All our Facebook followers are watching us live from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you live every Tuesday, and today we'll be doing a recap of the Russia-Africa Summit. So to start off, Shaka, about 43 heads of state and government showed up in Russia at a summit hosted by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Your assessment of the summit in Russia?
It was very, very interesting, and of course, they met in a very, very beautiful place. They met in Russia's resort city of Sochi. You're talking about around the Black Sea, region and all that kind of stuff. What was very interesting in that particular summit is that it was actually co-hosted by the chairman of the African Union, who also happens to be the president of Egypt. We're talking about Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. So it was very interesting that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and Mr. Putin co-hosted that very important summit. It was, of course, the first ever summit to be held under the auspices of what is called but mind you, this is a successor to what used to be the Soviet Union.
Interesting. So most of the talks are focused around trade and security. As a matter of fact, the president of Russia announced that he was writing off about $20 billion in debt for some of the African countries. How significant is that?
Well, very significant, especially for the countries that will benefit from that. And we are talking about countries like Egypt, countries like Madagascar, Mozambique, countries like Tanzania, and Ethiopia. They will. And by the way, I think some of this money, if not in fact most of it, is a carryover from what used to be the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation has not been that very much rich that could have, in fact, lent that kind of money to African countries. It's very interesting.
How about critics who say that maybe Russia was borrowing from the China playbook? China has been inviting African leaders to go to Beijing, and along the way they have discussed similar issues. They talk about trade, investment, or building infrastructure in Africa. But Russia, there are those who say that Russia, this is not the first time Russia is engaging in Africa. They have actually done more when you think about it. They've over the years, they played a significant role during the time of independence and after independence, trying to, in some areas like in South Africa, they're very instrumental in ending the apartheid regime in South Africa.
No, you're right, in the sense that when you talk about supporting the liberation struggles, it was not Russia, it was then the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union did not have a monopoly over that because China also, came along, and in fact you could also talk about some European countries, especially some of the Scandinavian countries and all that kind of stuff. But in this particular case, I don't think that Russia is doing anything particularly new. I don't think that Russia is doing anything particularly unique in terms of the manner in which it is trying to engage the African continent. And I don't think that it is necessarily borrowing a leaf from China or whatever, but it's about really how countries look at themselves vis-a-vis the other countries. countries, the last time I checked, Paul, have what they call vital national security interests. And it involves obviously trade, involves diplomatic, political, and all sorts of things in terms of interacting with other nations so that their people can obviously benefit from those types of relations. So Russia is not doing anything particularly new, nor is it particularly unique. If it can work for China, the argument will be it could also work for us.
Some of our fans have asked a question here. Let me go to it. They want to know why is it important for African leaders to go to Moscow, for example, or Beijing, or come here to the United States. Why can they have these summits back on the continent?
I think they have a very good point because, first of all, when you think about it really, Paul, it's just like looking at an incredibly beautiful, gorgeous lady. And you are having these rich, eligible bachelors courting her. That is Africa symbolically, because we're talking about resources here. All these countries, all these powers do not engage Africa because they love Africa. They engage Africa because they can actually benefit from that type of relationship.
Right.
We're talking about minerals, for example. If you are an industrial country, for example, like China, like countries under the European Union, like North America and what have you, you need copper. You need cobalt. You need coltan. You need tin. You need gold. You need diamonds. You need timber. You need all those types of things. And in fact, you also need food. Africa happens to be one of those places who probably have the lion's share of arable land. About 60% of the world's arable land, the last time I checked, is in fact found on the African continent. And so you're talking about these industrial countries like Russia, like China, like the European Union, like America, for example, selling agricultural products, like tractors and what have you. It is very interesting that when you look at what happened in Sochi, you had all these deals between Russia and some African countries buying helicopter gunships, buying, of course, AK-47s and what have you. I don't see much about tractors, and you name it. And in fact, those are the things that probably Africa needs first and foremost.
Great point. In fact, President Putin sort of said that they actually, in terms of trade, they do more in agriculture exports to Africa than they do in arms or anything else. They probably do about $30 billion of worth of agricultural products exports to Africa than $15 billion in arms. So how can Africa leverage on that, maybe to take advantage of that?
Guess what? If in fact there is any part of the world that probably need to be in the business of exporting food, of exporting agricultural products to other countries, it should be Africa. And let Africa wake up. But you see, the key is leadership. There are some pundits who have argued that Africa suffers from what they call a leadership deficit. Because sincerely, when you think about it, this is perhaps one of the most uniquely important moments when African leaders should be taking advantage of the position, the strategic position they find themselves in. This is the moment when you should be able to tell the difference between being a leader and being a ruler. In Sochi, you had 43, you said, heads of states, and in some cases, heads of governments.
Correct.
Perhaps you should break it down, in fact, in saying you did have most of those people as rulers, and very few of those people as leaders.
So Shaka, what's your takeaway from this summit?
I think it is a good thing for Africa, but probably most importantly at the moment right now, it's very good for Moscow. Moscow benefits enormously, and you can see how much money it actually did, despite having, in fact, forgiven $20 billion. They almost came out with probably equal amount of money in new trade, if not more. So it's up to Africa now. First of all, when you talk about Africa, Africa is not Russia. Why do I say that? I say that because Russia is a country. It's a nation. Africa, on the other hand, is not a country. It is a continent. It has 54 countries that form the African continent, and in fact, 55 member countries of the African Union, if you include Western Sahara, which is still obviously disputed by Morocco and what have you, and the international community. But we're talking about 54, 55 countries here. What they really need is to figure out what their priorities are. And their priorities should be to look out for the benefit of their people.
Shaka, let's do two quick follow-ups from our viewers here. One says, let's go to Amina. African leaders go there to look for arms, not agricultural exports. And another one, Godfrey says, Shaka, this is a club of beggars for military hardware. Your thoughts on that?
First of all, I don't think that they are beggars really for military hardware, because they do not get it for free. They actually pay for it. They pay for it with African wealth. I think there is nothing wrong in purchasing weapons from Russia, just as much as they purchase weapons from France, purchase weapons from the United Kingdom, purchase weapons from China, and what have you. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, why do you have to get into that business of purchasing weapons, which at the end of the day are actually used to kill one another?
So would it make a difference if they're importing, for example, medical equipment or school textbooks for that matter?
Of course it would. There's no question about it, because we are now talking sincerely. You're talking about the business of development. Africa, by the way, has a lot of very, very smart people in all sorts of disciplines and what have you. What they need and they don't have is the support of their leadership. They support the encouragement, the motivation of their leadership to be the best that they could be in the context of serving their own country or their own countries. So I think what we need here, sincerely, we need leaders. And we need that type of leader, sincerely, who is a servant leader, who is there to serve his or her people, so that those leaders can actually figure out a way of doing things that are in the interest of the vast majority of their people. So that, like people say, you know, you come into this world, you do things so that by the time you leave, at least you feel very comfortable and confident that you left it different from the way you found it.
Since we are talking about military aid or buying weapons from Russia, there is a person here who military have a place in removing autocrats who don't want to leave power?
It obviously does have a role in doing that, if in fact that military is a progressive type of military. You're talking about having the kind of progressive leadership. I think that there have been, for example, historically, some coups on the African continent, which were characterized by one of my friends, somebody that I admired so much. He was a great Pan-Africanist, a man from Zanzibar, from Tanzania, Abdul Rahman Babu. He was, in fact, at one time a great journalist who pretty much covered Africa. He also taught, by the way, at Amherst College in Massachusetts. And among the most prominent students that were in his class include Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta. Babu said they were, at least according to him, positive military coups in Africa. And one of those coups was the one that happened in Egypt in 1953 by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, the one that overthrew King Farouk. It did not introduce democracy, but it sort of introduced some aspects of social, economic, political justice. Then he talks about the coup in Ethiopia, the one that was responsible for overthrowing the emperor of Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie. It was a coup obviously led by a major Mengistu Haile Mariam, a coup that obviously some people will tell you it was probably a very bad thing to happen. But when you look at the land reforms that followed and what have you, sometimes you have to say, well, there was something that came out of it. But those are the views of my friend, the late Abdurrahman Babu. So yes, it is possible that a military can in fact play a positive role. More recently, you saw what the military did in collaboration with the young people of Burkina Faso. They were able, for example, the Presidential Guard, which was in fact meant and supposed to be guarding a man who the French called Handsome Blaise Compaoré, the man who, according to a lot of information, was probably responsible for the murder or assassination of a one-time very, very popular African leader who happened to be the strongman of Burkina Faso at that time, Captain Sankara.
Thomas Sankara.
Sankara.
Let's move on. Let's go all the way to Southern Africa. Let's go to Evangelist Kwasi Boke. Who is to blame for Zimbabwe's economic crisis? Sanctions, mismanagement of the economy. In light of what you just talked about, you talked about land reforms. Could this be a result of the land reforms that were implemented by the late President Robert Mugabe?
I think it is a combination really of both. First of all, you have to be able to understand the history of that country when it was called Southern Rhodesia. You have to understand how that country is a reflection or a beneficiary of a great explorer, British explorer, called Dr. David Livingstone. Dr. David Livingstone and his colleagues basically walked across the African continent. And in his particular case, he talked about the great 3 C's. He talked about that Europe had an obligation, for example, to spread what he called Christianity, civilization, and commerce. All those things, of course, are pretty much present there. But what didn't probably happen is if you talk about civilization and you look at its definition and what have you, one wonders, in fact, whether that is what Dr. David Livingstone meant. But when people like Sir John Cecil Rhodes, whose name, by the way, Rhodes, essentially became the name of that huge territory called Rhodesia. Eventually, it was divided in two parts, Northern Rhodesia, which is currently Zambia, Southern Rhodesia, which is currently Zimbabwe. This man came with his colleagues. They essentially took that land. They did not, the last time I checked, there is no history book that suggests that Sir John Cecil Rhodes and his colleagues actually bought land in those areas. They basically came and conquered the territory. And when you conquer territory, the implication is you kill people, you dispossess people of their land and what have you, you put in place a legal infrastructure or architecture, and you become a society. And so, yes, when you think about Robert Gabriel Mugabe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe had a huge problem when they discussed the independence of that territory at Lancaster House in London. When they discussed that, they decided that at least for the first, I think it was 10 years, they should not talk about the issue of land because it was a very emotive issue. And in fact, they did not, but that was in fact a time bomb really, left in to explode. And what happened was Mugabe went by the agreement. He was very much feted, by the way. He was very much welcome to Buckingham Palace, for example. He was in fact knighted, even though he never called himself sir. He was knighted. He was given a lot of honorary degrees by both United Kingdom and North America and what have you. He was...
Let's speak to the present. Is the economic crisis that Zimbabwe is facing has anything to do with what's going on right now?
Well, first of all, again, it reached a point where Mugabe probably didn't have much choice but to figure out how to deal with the elephant in the room, the land. Because the vast majority of the arable land in that country was owned by no more than probably 4,000 white commercial farmers. And you talk about how Zimbabwe used to be a breadbasket. It is true, but for who and at what expense? And so Mugabe had to make a very difficult decision. And the way he made it, it seems like he never really did it in a way that could accommodate a lot of interests. Mind you, the British, with the help of the United States under then President Jimmy Carter, had put together a fund that was supposed to be used to purchase the land from the white commercial farmers under a policy that was called willing seller. Willing buyer.
Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the Continental Free Trade Area. Let's go to Tiko Thomas in Arusha, Tanzania. What is the meaning of free trade in Africa if we need to have passports to cross borders to other African countries? And I see another comment from Soil Dead. Nigeria has closed its borders to traders. What about the free trade policy?
Conclude what I said earlier about Zimbabwe.
No, we spent a lot of time on Zimbabwe. Let's keep going.
But we talked about the willing seller and willing buyer.
Yes.
We did not talk about the fact that, for example, those monies were dispersed under Margaret Thatcher, under John Major.
Point taken.
But
Point taken. Let's keep going.
When Prime Minister Tony Blair came in power, that stopped. And so the dynamics changed. It's a very good thing. There's no question about it. But unless and until sincerely you reach a point where people are in a position where they are able to move freely, I don't think it is going to really work very hard. First and foremost, what is needed in Africa really is the presence of social, economic, political justice for all. It is a sort of democracy, whether one likes it or not. We need an infrastructure which helps to put in place an environment that enables things to be done. Because when you talk about trade, we're talking about superstructure. And so, until you are able to organize society in a manner that it allows people to conduct business normally without a lot of hindrance, you open the borders and boundaries. Ideas can essentially flourish. Movement of goods and services can move unhindered and all that kind of stuff. So we are really talking about, again, the dream of the founding fathers, especially the Ghanaian Osajefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, of African unity.
Shaka, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow it is very interesting because we are going to be talking about what happened in Xtra. We're talking about the first ever Russian-African summit. We look at who actually benefited and who didn't.
Very briefly, the UK is calling for an early election. Can you speak to that?
Well, it is very interesting that eventually the opposition, especially the Labour Party, has actually signed on to it. I know that the Liberal Democrats were for it, and the party also representing the interests of Scotland was for it. But, you know, it is interesting because they probably see the public opinion polls looking good, so that it's quite possible there could be change. You know, the first time they actually took that vote in the British Parliament was yesterday, and yesterday it didn't go through.
Could this be the beginning of the end of Boris Johnson?
It could be the beginning of the end of Boris Johnson, a man who at one time, by the way, belonged to our journalistic tribe.
Well, on that note, Shaka, we've run out of time. I look forward to hosting you on another edition. To all our viewers, thank you so much for being part of this show. We look forward to another edition next week. Until then, thank you and so long from Washington. Thank you.
Overdue. 1.5 million Armenians and thousands of Maronites, Chaldeans, Melkites, Assyrians, and others who were part of the Ottoman Empire. Mr. Speaker, my grandparents left the Ottoman Empire to escape that genocide just ahead, but their relatives were not as lucky.